More than 300 million years ago, long before cities, before birds, before the familiar forests of oak and pine, the earth carried a different kind of morning. Mist drifted slowly across endless wetlands, warm and heavy, clinging to towering plants that no longer exist today. The air felt thick, almost syrupy, as if the planet itself breathed more deeply than it does now. Across this ancient landscape rose forests that would look alien to modern eyes. Giant clumos trees lifted their scaled trunks nearly 30 meters toward the pale sky. Enormous ferns unfolded wide green fans that caught the sunlight and scattered it into soft emerald light. Beneath them the ground remained wet and dark, layered with fallen plants slowly turning into the coal seams that future civilizations would one day pull from the earth. For a moment the world seems completely still. No birds call across the canopy. No distant engines hum beyond the trees. Only the slow breath of swamp water and the quiet rustle of leaves disturb the silence. It is a peaceful scene, almost gentle, the kind of place where time appears to move with extraordinary patience. Then a shadow passes over the treetops. At first it moves so quietly that it almost escapes. Notice, sliding across the mist like a drifting cloud. The forest below does not react. The water continues to ripple. But the shadow grows larker, and suddenly the sky above the swamp reveals its hidden ruler. Gliding through the humid air is a creature that resembles a dragonfly, yet far larger than anything alive today. Its wings stretch wide and transparent, catching the light as they beat slowly against the heavy atmosphere. Nearly centimeters from tip to tip, the insect drifts with quiet confidence, scanning the forest below for movement. This ancient hunter is known as Meganeura. Long before birds learned to command the sky, and long before bats emerged from dark caves, creatures like this ruled the air above the Carboniferous world. Their wings carried them over swamps and forests that stretched across entire continents. To modern eyes, the sight would feel impossible. Today, the largest dragonflies span little more than a human hand. Insects seem delicate, small, almost fragile. Yet the rocks beneath parts of Europe and North America preserve the unmistakable outlines of wings far larger than any living insect should possess. These fossils reveal a world where insects did not merely survive, they dominated. Dragonflies hunted like hawks above the wetlands. Millipedes longer than a human arm move slowly through dense vegetation. The skies and forest floors belong to creatures that today sound closer to fantasy than natural history. So a quiet question begins to form. How could animals built with such thin bodies and fragile wings ever grow to such extraordinary size? What allowed them to rise above these forests like living aircraft when modern insects remain so small? The answer is not hidden in the insects alone. It lies in the air they breathe, the forests that surrounded them, and the ancient chemistry of a planet that once worked very differently from the one we know. But that truth is not immediately obvious when watching a giant wing glide through mist. In this moment the creature simply exists, silent and graceful, a predator perfectly suited to its world. Yet the deeper story has only begun. The forest below, the heavy atmosphere, strange biology of insects are all pieces of a puzzle stretching back hundreds of millions of years. To understand how a dragonfly could grow as wide as a hawk, we must step further into this forgotten world and examine the environment that made such giants possible. Because once we look closer, the mystery shifts. The only unusual part of this ancient earth, the forests were different, the climate was different. Even the air itself held secrets that modern skies no longer carry, and understanding that strange atmosphere is where our journey truly begins today. To understand how insects once grew so large, it helps to step deeper into the world they inhabited. The Carboniferous Earth was not simply an older version of the forest we know today. It was something stranger, a landscape shaped by plants and climates that have no true modern equivalent. Across vast stretches of the planet, enormous swamp forests spread over lowlands and river basins. Continents were slowly drifting together, assembling piece by piece into the giant landmass that would eventually become Pangaea. Between rising mountain ranges and shallow seas, warm wetlands flourished under heavy skies. The forests themselves looked unfamiliar. Instead of oaks, maples or pines, the dominant plants were towering lycopsids, giant relatives of the small clumos plants that now grow close to the forest floor. In the Carboniferous age, these trees could rise 30 meters into the air, their trunks covered in repeating diamond patterns that resembled reptile scales. Between them grew enormous horsetails, tall hollow plants arranged in dense clusters. From a distance, they might have looked like groves of green bamboo swaying gently in the warm wind. Ferns spread wide fronds across the humid understory, creating a layered canopy that filtered sunlight into deep shades of emerald and gold. And yet something else was missing. There were no flowers blooming across as had not yet appeared. The forests held no birds calling across branches and no mammals moving through the shadows. Even the first dinosaurs remained far in the future, still waiting millions of years to evolve. The land felt quieter, simpler. Along muddy riverbanks, amphibians moved slowly between water and land, their bodies still tied closely to ancient aquatic ancestry. Nearby, the earliest reptiles were beginning a quiet evolutionary experiment, developing the ability to reproduce without returning to water. But many ecological roles remained unclaimed, and insects moved quickly to fill them. Above the wetlands, giant dragonfly relatives patrolled open airspace, their wings catching sunlight as they hunted smaller insects drifting in the humid air. On the forest floor, early cockroach, like spexies, crawled between fallen leaves and tangled roots. Massive millipedes wound their way slowly through the vegetation, feeding on the endless supply of decaying plants. This ecosystem produced plant life in staggering abundance. Year after year, dense forests grew across warm swamps, shedding leaves, branches, and entire trunks into shallow water. But when these plants died, something unusual happened. In many places, the swamp waters contained very little oxygen. Without oxygen, the normal process of decay slowed dramatically. Instead of breaking down completely, plant material accumulated in thick layers along the forest floor. Over time, those layers were buried beneath sediment and compressed by immense geological pressure. Millions of years later, humans would dig into the earth and discover these ancient deposits as coal. Yet while carbon, something else remained above the surface. Oxygen. As Carboniferous forests expanded across the planet, they quietly altered the chemistry of the atmosphere. With more carbon locked away beneath sediments, oxygen levels in the air began rising higher than at almost any other point in Earth history. No creature could see this transformation happening. The skies looked the same, the forest remained lush, and life continued its daily rhythms. But the air itself was changing. And within that invisible shift lay one of the most important clues in our story. Because the true secret behind giant insects may not have been their wings, their muscles, or even their evolution. It may have been the atmosphere surrounding them. To understand why that matters, we must look closer at something deceptively simple: how insects breathe. At first glance, insects appear simple. Their bodies are small, their movements quick, their lives often brief. Yet hidden beneath their thin shells lies a biological system, unlike anything found in mammals, birds, or reptiles. The way insects breed from our own that it almost feels like another design entirely. Most animals rely on lungs. Air enters the body, oxygen moves into the bloodstream, and the heart carries it through a network of vessels to every cell. It is a familiar system, one shared by Creativity across much of the animal. Instead of lungs, their bodies contain a delicate network of microscopic tubes called tracheae. These tiny channels run throughout the insect's body like the branches of an intricate tree. Along the sides of the insect's abdomen are small openings known as spiracles. Through these openings, air enters directly from the outside world. Once inside, oxygen does not travel through blood. It moves through the tracheal tubes themselves, spreading inward until it reaches the cells that need it. For a small creature, this system works beautifully. Oxygen slips through the spiracles, flows along branching tubes, and reaches tissues with remarkable efficiency. There is no need for a heart to pump oxygen around the body. The air simply spreads where it is needed. But this elegant system carries a hidden limit. Oxygen moves through these tubes primarily by diffusion. Diffusion is a slow process where molecules drift from areas of higher concentration toward areas of lower concentration. It works well across tiny distances. Yet the larger an organism becomes, the farther oxygen must travel to reach its deepest tissues. And the farther it must travel, the harder that journey becomes. In modern conditions, this physical constraint places a quiet ceiling on insect size. If an insect grows too large, oxygen can no longer reach every part of its body efficiently. Cells begin to starve of energy. Movement slows. Survival becomes difficult. This is why the insects around us today remain relatively small. A dragonfly might span a few centimeters. Beetles and grasshoppers rarely grow larger than a human hand. Yet the ancient Carboniferous world was different. 300 million years ago, the atmosphere contained far more oxygen than it does today. Scientists estimate that oxygen levels may have reached 30, perhaps even 35% of the air. Today, that number sits closer to 21. The difference might not sound dramatic, but for insects it changed everything. With so much oxygen present in the air, diffusion became far more effective. Oxygen molecules were everywhere, crowding the atmosphere and pressing inward through every spiracle. The tracheal tubes inside insect bodies could deliver far more oxygen than they can under modern conditions. Cells received more energy. Muscles grew stronger. Bodies could expand without suffocating themselves. In a world like that, insects were no longer confined to small sizes. They could grow, and grow they did. Dragonflies stretched wings nearly 70 centimeters across. Millipedes crawled through forests longer than a human arm. The physical limits that constrain insects today had loosened under an oxygen-rich sky. In a sense, the atmosphere itself was supporting them. The air carried their bodies, fed their cells, and quietly allowed a scale of life that would later seem impossible. Yet oxygen alone does not explain everything. Even in a rich as must compete for space, food, and survival. In today's skies, countless animals patrol the air in search of prey. But during the Carboniferous age, something unusual was true. The skies were empty. No bats crossed the canopy. No bait shot, latieti in the even air. No vertebrate wings sliced through the atmosphere. For millions of years, insects had the sky almost entirely to themselves. And that quiet absence would prove just as important as the oxygen that filled the air. To understand once ruled the skies, the story must widen its view. The answer does not rest entirely within the bodies of those creatures. It lies within the planet itself. Earth, after all, is not a static world. Its surface shifts, its climate evolves, and even the air surrounding it changes over immense spans of time. Today, the atmosphere feels permanent. 78% nitrogen, with traces of other gases drifting invisibly through the sky. We breathe it without thinking, assuming it has always been this way. But the Earth has never breathed the same air for long, across hundreds of millions of years. The atmosphere has risen and fallen, like a slow. Oxygen levels climb, then retreat again, responding to the quiet partnership between geology and life. Mountains rise and erode, oceans expand and withdraw, and plants, silently covering the continents, transform the chemistry of the sky. During the Carboniferous period, this balance shifted dramatically. At that time, enormous swamp forests stretched across much of the planet. The continent yet fully assembled into Pangaea, but vast lowland regions lay near the equator, warm and wet for most of the year. In these humid landscapes, plants grew with astonishing density. Towering liculted trees formed forests that spread across endless wetlands. Giant horsetails and thick ferns filled the spaces between them. Every year these ecosystems produced immense amounts of plant life, far more than modern forests create today. Normally when plants die, they return their carbon to the atmosphere. Microorganisms break them down, releasing carbon dioxide back into the air as part of the endless cycle of life and decay. But the Carboniferous swamps interrupted that cycle. Much of the forest floor lay beneath shallow, stagnant water. In these waterlogged soils, oxygen was scarce. Without oxygen, the microbes responsible for decomposition struggled to survive. Fallen trees, leaves, and branches did not fully decay. Instead, they accumulated. Layer upon layer of plant material gathered across the swampy ground, slowly buried beneath sediment carried by rivers and floods. Over immense spans of time, pressure and heat compressed these layers into something new. What humans now burn to power cities and industries began as those ancient forests, quietly preserved beneath the Earth's surface. Yet this buried an unexpected consequence. When carbon from plants becomes trapped underground instead of returning to the atmosphere, something remains behind. The oxygen those plants released during photosynthesis stays in the air. And as Carboniferous forests continued expanding, this effect intensified. The more plants grew, the more oxygen accumulated. Over millions of years, the atmosphere slowly thickened with it, rising far beyond the levels modern life experiences today. The planet itself was breathing differently. In such an oxygen-rich world, the air carried more energy. Fires burned hotter. Animals inhaled deeper reserves of oxygen with every breath. and insects, whose bodies depend on oxygen moving directly through delicate internal tubes, suddenly found themselves living in an atmosphere perfectly suited to larger forms. The sky itself had changed the rules of biology. What seems impossible in modern ecosystems became entirely possible in that ancient world. Wings could grow wider, bodies could grow heavier, work harder without starving for oxygen. It was not simply that insects evolved to become giants. The planet allowed them to. Yet this transformation carried consequences no Jew could foresee. When it grows abundant enough, it alters the very behavior of fire. And in a world filled with dense forests and oxygen, rich air, flames could spread with a force rarely seen today. The Carboniferous forests were not only fertile, were flammable. The forests of the Carboniferous world seemed almost endless. Wetlands stretched across continents, dense with towering plants and tangled undergrowth. Warm air drifted slowly between the trunks of ancient trees, while shallow water pooled across the forest floor. Life flourished here in quiet abundance. Leaves fell, new plants rose, and insects moved through a world that appeared stable and timeless. Yet hidden within this lush landscape was a quiet danger. The same oxygen-rich atmosphere that allowed insects to grow to remarkable sizes also made the forests far more vulnerable to fire. Oxygen does more than sustain breathing. It fuels combustion. When oxygen levels rise, flames find it easier to ignite and spread. Materials that might struggle to burn in today's atmosphere can ignite far more readily when oxygen becomes abundant. During the Carboniferous period, that difference mattered. Lightning storms frequently rolled across these ancient wetlands. Thunderheads gathered above the vast forests, their towering clouds releasing flashes of electricity that struck the ground with tremendous force. In modern ecosystems, damp vegetation often prevents lightning from starting large fires. But in an atmosphere rich with oxygen, even moist plant material could catch flame. A single strike might be enough. Evidence of these fires remains preserved in stone. In Carboniferous rock layers, scientists have discovered widespread deposits of fossilized charcoal. These blackened fragments are the quiet fingerprints of ancient wildfires that once swept through forests hundreds of millions of years ago. When lightning ignited dry patches of vegetation, flames could spread rapidly across the landscape. Thick undergrowth burned first, sending smoke drifting above the wetlands. Find the trunks of trees and race through dense stands of horsetails. Entire sections of forest could vanish beneath walls of flame. Thought first gleeth falls of flame. Such fires might sound destructive, even catastrophe, but nature offers rather than disasters. Many ecosystems benefit from periodic fire. Flames clear out older vegetation, opening space for new growth. Ash returns nutrients to the soil, enriching the ground for future plants. Even today, forests in many parts of the world depend on occasional fires to maintain balance. The Carboniferous forests likely experienced similar rhythms. A region might burn, fall quiet for years, and then slowly regenerate as new plants rose from the soil. Fresh vegetation would spread across the wetlands, attracting insects and other animals back into the recovering landscape. Life continued changing terrain. But these cycles introduced something important into the Carboniferous world. Instability. Forests no longer remained perfectly undeformed across the continents. Habitats fires cleared some areas while others grew dense with vegetation. Rivers changed course, swamps expanded or receded, and ecosystems adjusted to new patterns of growth and destruction. For construction, insects, these changes mattered. Their success depended on warm, humid forests filled with plant life and smaller prey. When fires reshaped the land, the distribution of food and shelter shifted with it. Some regions became rich hunting grounds while others turned temporarily barren. Over centuries and millennia populations of insects rose and fell alongside the forests that supported them. The Carboniferous world was incredibly productive, but it was not perfectly stable. Beneath its green canopy, the environment was constantly adjusting, burning, regrowing, and reshaping itself. And while these changes unfolded on the surface, deeper transformations were quietly beginning across the planet. Continents were drifting, climates were shifting, atmospheric chemistry continued evolving. The insects that filled the skies were thriving in a moment of extraordinary opportunity. But even as they ruled the air above the forests, the conditions that allowed their greatness were already beginning to move toward something new. For now, however, the giants still soared and, for millions of years, The skies remained theirs. For a long stretch of Earth's deep past, the skies belonged to insects. Above the endless wetlands of the Carboniferous world, great wings moved through warm, heavy air. The atmosphere, rich with oxygen, carried these creatures with surprising ease. What would seem impossible in modern skies felt natural in that ancient environment. On the whole, the most impressive of these aerial hunters were the dragonflies. Despite their name, they were not true dragonflies, though they resembled them closely. Their bodies were long and narrow, built for speed and control. Two pairs of powerful wings stretched wide from their thorax, catching sunlight as they glided above the forest canopy. Some spans close to 70 centimeters larger than many modern birds. When these giants moved through the sky, they did not flutter like small insects today. Their wings beat slowly and deliberately, carrying them across wetlands in long. From above, they watched the world beneath them with large compound eyes, capable of detecting the slightest motion. Below the canopy, smaller insects drifted through the humid air. Many never saw the hunter coming. With sudden bursts of speed, dragonflies could dive through the forest openings, seizing prey in powerful jaws before rising once again into the open sky. In a world without birds or bats, these insects were the undisputed masters of aerial hunting. But the giants were not confined to the air. On the forest floor, another creature moved slowly between thick roots and fallen branches. It did not fly. It did not hunt. Yet its size was even more astonishing. Arthropleura, this massive millipede, like arthropods, stretched longer than 2 meters in some species. Its segmented body formed a wide armored ribbon that wound across the damp ground of the Carboniferous forests. Dozens of legs moved in quiet coordination, carrying the creature through dense vegetation as it fed on decaying plants. Where modern millipedes remained small and hidden beneath leaves, arthropleura would have been impossible to ignore. Its broad body pushed through the undergrowth like a slow-moving train, quietly recycling the endless supply of fallen plant material covering the forest floor. Together, creatures like dragonflies and arthropleura formed only a small part of a much larger insect world. Cockroach relatives crawled among the roots. Early beetle-like species explored tree bark and leaf litter. Countless smaller insects filled the air and soil, creating complex food webs across these ancient ecosystems. For millions of years, the conditions supporting this world remained remarkably stable. Oxygen-rich air fed the terrestrial systems of insects. Vast forests produced abundant plant life. Wetlands provided endless habitat for creatures that depended on humidity and warmth. And above all, the skies remained almost entirely empty of vertebrate predators. There were no birds slicing through the air in pursuit of insects, no bats emerging at dusk across the canopy. The aerial world remained open, allowing insects to evolve into forms that modern ecosystems. In this moment of Earth's history, insects were not merely participants in the ecosystem. They were its dominant force. Yet even the most successful evolutionary age exists within the boundaries of the planet that supports it. Continents were slowly drifting across the globe, assembling into new configurations. Mountain ranges rose. Climate patterns shifted gradually across the surface. These changes were subtle, almost invisible within the lifetime of any creature living in those forests. But over millions of years they began ants that had allowed giant insects to thrive. The atmosphere itself was starting to change. Oxygen levels, once abundant, would not remain so forever. As the planet continued evolving, the very conditions that created the giants of the insect world began quietly fading. And when the air changed, the fate of those giants would change with it. For a long time, the Carboniferous world seemed almost permanent. Forests stretched endlessly across warm wetlands. Insects drifted through the heavy air, and the atmosphere itself held more oxygen than the planet had experienced in ages. Life moved within this balance for millions of years, as if the conditions that supported it might last forever. But Earth rarely remains unchanged. The first signs of transformation were not sudden or dramatic. No great disaster swept across the continents. No single moment announced the beginning of a new age. Instead, the planet began shifting through forces so slow that no living creature could perceive them. Far beneath the forests, tectonic plates continued their ancient journey. Massive slabs of the Earth drifted gradually across the surface, carrying entire continents with them. Over immense stretches of time, these landmasses began colliding, assembling into the enormous supercontinent that would later be known as Pangaea. As continents merged, the geography of the planet changed. Coastlines shifted. Mountain ranges pushed against each other. Vast interior regions formed far from the cooling influence of the oceans. Areas that had once been coastal wetlands slowly transformed into dreary landscapes. For the swamp forests of the Carboniferous, these ecosystems had depended on warm, humid environments, where water lingered across lowland terrain. As climate chilled and grew drier, many of the wetlands that once nourished those forests began shrinking. The change was gradual, unfolding across millions of years, but its consequences reached far beyond the plants rooted in those ancient soils. With fewer swamp forests covering the continents, less plant material became buried beneath oxygen-poor sediments. The process that had quietly removed carbon from the atmosphere began slowing down. And with that shift, the chemistry of the air itself began to change. The atmosphere that had once grown richer with oxygen slowly began losing some of that abundance. Oxygen levels did not collapse at sudden levels. They declined gently, almost imperceptibly at first, drifting downward across geological time. For a long while, the air still carried more oxygen than it does today. Giant insects continued gliding through the skies above the forests. Dragonflies still hunted across the wetlands. Arthropleura still moved through thick vegetation along the forest floor. To any creature living in that world, life might have appeared unchanged. Yet biology can be surprisingly sensitive to subtle environmental shifts. The breathing system that sustained insects relied entirely on the surrounding atmosphere. Oxygen had to diffuse through spiracles and travel along delicate tracheal tubes to reach every cell inside the body. When oxygen was abundant, this system allowed insects to grow large and powerful. But as oxygen levels slowly declined, the limits of that system began tightening once again. The change was not immediate. Generation after generation of insects continued living beneath the same forests. Yet over long spans of time, the conditions that had once supported enormous bodies became less favorable. The age of giant insects had depended on a particular combination of circumstances: vast forests, abundant oxygen, warm climates, and open skies. And those conditions were beginning to fade. The realization arrives quietly. The giant insects that once ruled the Carboniferous skies were not permanent masters of their world. They were creatures living within a rare moment of planetary history, a brief window when the atmosphere allowed their extraordinary size. As the Earth continued reshaping itself, that window began slowly closing. The air that had once supported giants was drifting towards something more familiar. And as the air changed, the ecosystem surrounding those insects began transforming as well, introducing challenges that even the rulers of the ancient sky had never faced before. The Carboniferous forests had once seemed endless. Wetlands stretched from horizon to horizon, their dense vegetation rising from warm, shallow waters that rarely dried. For millions of years, these ecosystems defined the world insects inhabited. The air was humid, the ground soft with decaying plants, and the forests themselves formed a vast green engine quietly shaping the atmosphere above. But the Earth, beneath those forests, was still moving. As tectonic plates drifted slowly across the planet, continents continued their long journey toward collisions. Over immense stretches of time, landmasses merged together, forming the enormous supercontinent that would later be called Pangaea. This transformation altered the geography of the world in ways that were subtle at first, yet profound in the long run. When continents assemble into a single massive landmass, something important happens to the climate. Regions far from the ocean begin to appear. These inland areas no longer feel the steady influence of coastal weather patterns. Instead, they experience stronger seasonal shifts, greater temperature extremes, and longer dry periods. The Carboniferous world, once dominated by endless wetlands, began slowly developing these interior landscapes. Where shallow swamps had once stretched across broad lowlands, drier environments gradually emerged. Some regions lost their constant humidity as rainfall patterns shifted. Rivers carved new paths across the forming supercontinent, and wetlands that had once remained permanently flooded began shrinking. The forests did not vanish overnight, but they changed. Dense swamp ecosystems retreated toward areas where water still lingered. In other places, new plant communities appeared into soils that periodically dried and climates that fluctuated more dramatically through the seasons. The world was becoming more varied. For giant insects, these changes introduced unexpected difficulties. Their enormous bodies had evolved under conditions of stable humidity, abundant vegetation, rich air. The swamp forests provided not only food but also the environmental stability that large insects required to thrive. As those wetlands shrank, so did the habitats supporting many of the creatures that lived within them. Humidity dropped in certain regions. Plant communities shifted. Food sources changed as ancient forests gave way to new vegetation better suited to emerging climates. Some insect species adapted and moved with the changing ecosystems. Others found their range slowly narrowing as the environments they depended on became less common. Meanwhile, other forms of life were quietly advancing. Amphibians continued diversifying alike shores, exploring new ecological niches across the changing landscape. Early reptiles began achieving something evolutionarily remarkable, the ability to reproduce entirely on land. Unlike amphibians, they no longer needed to return to water to lay their eggs. This adaptation moved farther into the developing interior regions of Pangaea. As reptiles spread into new habitats, vertebrate predators became increasingly common across forests and plains. Small hunters stalked insects and other invertebrates along the ground. Larger creatures began shaping food webs in ways that had not existed during the height of the Carboniferous wetlands. The ecosystems of the planet were becoming more complex. Once giant insects had ruled an environment with relatively few competitors and few specialized predators. The skies above the swamp forests had been wide and open, largely free of animals capable of sustained flight. No, the balance was beginning to shift. The world that had produced giant insects was slowly transforming beneath their wings. Wetlands were shrinking, new landscapes were emerging, and the communities of animals moving through those landscapes were becoming more diverse and competitive. For a long time, the giant flyers of the ancient world continued to glide above forests and wetlands. But the stability that had supported their reign was gradually fading. Environmental change alone would challenge their dominance. Yet another transformation was quietly approaching, one that would reshape the skies themselves. For millions of years, the skies above the ancient forests had belonged almost entirely to insects. Warm air rose from wetlands, carrying dragonfly, like hunters across open spaces between towering plants. Wings shimmered in the sunlight, and the largest among them moved with slow confidence through an atmosphere that favored their size. In that world, flight was an insect invention. No bird cut across the canopy, no bat circled above the evening swamps. The air was discovered and mastered long before any vertebrate creature had even attempted to claim it. For an immense stretch of time, that dominance seemed unquestioned, yet evolution rarely leaves opportune. Across the shifting landscapes of the late Paleozoic world, animals were quietly exploring new possibilities. On land, reptiles were becoming more diverse and adaptable. Some species were growing larger, others were developing lighter skeletons and more efficient ways of moving across dry ground. Among these evolving creatures, a new idea was slowly taking shape: flight. The first true vertebrates, powered flight would not appear until the Triassic period, many millions of years after the height of the Carboniferous insect giants. But evolution does not live powered, suddenly from ground to sky. It experiments gradually, testing new forms and structures across generations. At some point during these distant ages, certain reptiles began developing bodies suited to an unusual transformation. Their limbs grew longer and lighter. Bones became hollow and strong. Skin stretched between elongated fingers, forming the early shapes of wings. Eventually, these changes produced a remarkable group of animals known as pterosaurs. Unlike insects, pterosaurs were vertebrates. Their bodies contained lungs capable of drawing in large volumes of air. Their circulatory systems could move oxygen efficiently through muscles built for sustained motion. Their wings, formed from membranes of skin supported by extended fingers, allowed them to glide and eventually fly with surprising agility. When the first pterosaurs rose into the air, the skies of Earth began changing forever. Insects had once ruled those skies simply because no other animals shared them. But now, a new kind of flyer had appeared, one built on a completely different biological design, where insects relied on diffusion through tracheal tubes. Vertebrate flyers breathed through lungs and pumped oxygen through blood. Their muscles could power longer flights. Their bodies could grow large without facing the same respiratory limitations that constrained insects. At first, these flying reptiles were not immediate replacements for the giant insects that had dominated earlier ages. The change unfolded gradually, as evolutionary changes always do. But the presence of vertebrate flyers introduced something that had been absent for hundreds of millions of years: competition. The aerial environment was no longer empty. It was becoming part of a larger ecosystem where multiple forms of life could hunt, glide, and explore the skies. At the same time, the atmosphere itself continued shifting. Oxygen levels were slowly declining from the heights reached during the Carboniferous forests. Environmental changes were already making it harder for insects to sustain enormous body sizes. No, another pressure was beginning to emerge. The skies were becoming crowded. The giants of the insect world were not simply shrinking because the air contained less oxygen. They were also living through the early stages of a profound evolutionary transition. For the first time in hundreds of millions of years, insects were no longer alone above the earth. And this shift was only one part of a much larger transformation, still unfolding across the planet. Because soon, Earth itself would enter one of the most dramatic crises in the entire history of life. By the time the Carboniferous giants were fading from their ancient skies, the Earth was already moving towards something far more dramatic. The slow shifts of climate and atmosphere that had begun millions of years earlier were about to converge into one of the most severe crises life had ever faced. Geologists call this moment the Permian-Triassic extinction. Many simply call it the Great Dying. Around 252 million years ago, the balance of life on Earth collapsed on a scale almost impossible to imagine. Entire ecosystems that had flourished for hundreds of millions of years began unraveling. The oceans, once filled with diverse marine creatures, lost nearly 90% of their species. On land, roughly 70% of known animal life disappeared. Yet the catastrophe did not unfold as a single sudden blow. There was no solitary asteroid strike ending an age in an instant. Instead, the planet entered a chain reaction of environmental changes that unfolded over thousands of years, each stage amplifying the next. The trigger lay deep beneath the surface of what is now Siberia. There, enormous volcanic eruptions began pouring molten rock across vast regions of the landscape. These eruptions were not brief explosions. They continued for immense periods of time, releasing rivers of lava that covered millions of square kilometers. Along with lava came gases, immense quantities of carbon dioxide, methane and sulfur, compounds forced into the atmosphere from deep within the Earth. As these gases accumulated in the sky, the climate of the planet began shifting rapidly. Carbon dioxide trapped heat in the atmosphere, pushing global temperatures upward. Oceans warmed. Ice disappeared from polar regions. Weather patterns grew unstable as the planet adjusted to this sudden change. The oceans themselves began transforming. Warmer waters held less dissolved oxygen. Marine ecosystems that depended on stable oxygen levels began struggling to survive. Entire communities of ocean life collapsed as the chemistry of the seas changed around them. On land, forests faced new pressures as heat and environmental instability reshaped habitats across continents. Plants struggled in regions where rainfall patterns shifted or temperatures climbed beyond their limits. And once again, the atmosphere itself changed. During the earlier Carboniferous age, forests had drawn carbon out of the air and helped oxygen levels climb to extraordinary heights. No, the opposite process began unfolding. Massive volcanic emissions flooded the atmosphere with carbon dioxide while ecosystems weakened across the planet. Oxygen levels declined even further. For many animals, this change made survival increasingly difficult. But for creatures whose bodies relied entirely on atmospheric oxygen to function, the impact was especially severe. Belonged to that group, their breathing system depended on oxygen diffusing directly through spiracles and branching tracheilae. Cubes were tube arms. When oxygen was abundant, this design allowed their bodies to grow large and powerful. But as oxygen concentrations fell, the efficiency of that system declined. The larger the insect, the harder it became to deliver enough oxygen to its deepest tissues. What had once been an advantage, size, strength, wings powerful enough to patrol ancient skies, was slowly becoming a burden. The Great Dying did not single out insects alone. It reshaped nearly every ecosystem on the planet. Species that had dominated oceans and land for millions of years vanished from the fossil record, replaced eventually by new forms of life adapted to the faulted world. In many ways, this moment acted as a planetary reset. Entire evolutionary pathways ended. New opportunities opened for creatures capable of surviving the harsher conditions that followed. For the giant sect, however, the future was becoming increasingly uncertain. The atmosphere that had once allowed them to flourish was disappearing, and in the thinner, changing air of the Permian world, their enormous bodies faced conditions they had never evolved to survive. When the atmosphere began losing its extraordinary richness in oxygen, the consequences for insects unfolded quietly but relentlessly. Nothing dramatic marked the moment. There was no sudden disappearance of the giant flyers that had once patrolled Carboniferous skies. Instead, the transformation happened gradually, generation after generation, as life responded to the changing air. The biology of insects made them especially sensitive to this shift. Unlike animals that breathe through lungs and circulate oxygen through blood, insects depend entirely on diffusion. Air enters their bodies through spiracles and moves through branching tracheal tubes until it reaches the cells that need it. When oxygen concentrations are high, this system works remarkably well, even in large bodies. But as oxygen levels decline, diffusion becomes less efficient. The farther oxygen must travel through those microscopic tubes, the harder it becomes to reach every tissue. For small insects, this challenge remains manageable. Their bodies are compact, their cells close to the source of oxygen entering through the spiracles. Large insects face a different problem. Their tissues lie farther from the openings where air enters the body. Oxygen must travel longer distances through the tracheal network. When the atmosphere contains less oxygen, the supply reaching those distant cells becomes weaker. For the giant insects of the Carboniferous age, this change slowly turned size from an advantage into a limitation. Evolution rarely responds with sudden disappearance. Instead, it reshapes species over long spans of time. As environmental conditions shift, individuals better suited to those new conditions survive and reproduce more successfully. In an atmosphere with declining oxygen, smaller insects gained an advantage. Their bodies required less oxygen to sustain themselves. Diffusion through their tracheal systems remained efficient. They could move, hunt, and reproduce without the metabolic strain that larger bodies began to experience. Over thousands and then millions of years, natural selection quietly favored these smaller forms. The fossil record reflects this gradual adjustment. In the layers of rock that follow the Carboniferous period, the enormous wings of dragonflies become increasingly rare. Their descendants continue to appear, but their size shrinks noticeably compared to the giants that once ruled the air. Dragonflies did not vanish entirely. They remained skilled aerial hunters, capable of swift and precise flight. But their wingspans grew smaller, their bodies more compact, better suited to an atmosphere that no longer supported giant insects. The giants disappeared altogether. The massive millipede arthropleura, once stretching across forest floors like a living armored ribbon, vanishes from the fossil record. No creature of similar size would ever replace it among terrestrial arthropods. What remained was a new version of the insect world. Smaller dragonflies continued hunting above lakes and wetlands. Beetles, cockroach relatives, and countless other insects adapted to the changing climates of the early Mesozoic era. Their diversity expanded even as their size decreased. The age of enormous insects did not end through sudden extinction, it faded. Across millions of years, evolutionary pressure reshaped bodies to match the atmosphere surrounding them. The giants gradually gave way to forms that could thrive in thinner air. By the time the Mesozoic era fully arrived, the skies of Earth looked very different from those of the Carboniferous forests. The enormous wings that once dominated the air had largely disappeared. Yet insects themselves remained remarkably resilient. They adapted to the new world, rather than vanishing with the old one. Smaller bodies, quicker life cycles, and diverse ecological strategies allowed them to continue spreading across nearly every habitat on land. The giants were gone, but their lineage endured. And even as insects entered the new atmosphere, another transformation was beginning high above the forests, one that would forever change who ruled the skies. As the age of giant insects faded, the skies above the Earth did not remain empty for long. Nature rarely allows a space to remain forever. When one dominant group retreats, another eventually discovers the opportunity waiting there. During the Triassic period, roughly 50 million years after the Great Dying reshaped life across the planet, a remarkable new group of animals appeared. These were the pterosaurs. Unlike insects, whose wings were extensions of a lightweight exoskeleton, pterosaurs flew with wings made from living skin. A thin membrane stretched from their bodies along an enormously elongated finger, forming a flexible wing capable of powerful movement through the air. Their skeletons were light but strong, built from hollow bones that balanced strength with efficiency. At first glance they may have looked fragile, yet their bodies held a fundamental advantage over insects. They breathed with lungs. Inside their chests, air moved through complex respiratory systems that could draw oxygen deep into the body. Their hearts pumped oxygen, rich blood through networks of vessels, feeding muscles capable of sustained flight. This biological design allowed vertebrate flyers to grow larger and more powerful, even as atmospheric oxygen levels continued declining. Where giant insects had once depended entirely on diffusion through delicate tubes, pterosaurs carried their oxygen directly through circulating blood. This difference mattered enormously. As the Triassic skies filled with these early flying reptiles, the aerial world began changing in ways insects had never experienced before. The air was no longer a quiet hunting ground where dragonfly, like predators, glided alone across open wetlands. A new competitor had arrived. Pterosaurs soared above coastlines and inland lakes, searching for fish, small animals, and insects. Some species remained modest in size, but others grew impressively large, their wings stretching several meters across the sky. And evolution did not stop there. Millions of years later, during the Jurassic period, another breakthrough occurred. A small group of feathered dinosaurs developed wings capable of true powered flight. These creatures would eventually become the first birds. Feathers, membranes, lightweight skeletons, and powerful chest muscles allowed these animals to flap through the air with extraordinary agility. Birds could perch in trees, launch into flight instantly, and maneuver through forests in ways no pterosaur could match. Later, another group of animals entered the sky. Emerging long after the dinosaurs disappeared, bats became the first mammals to achieve true flight. Their wings, formed from skin stretched across elongated fingers, allowed them to navigate the night skies with silent precision. Many hunted insects directly, using echolocation to detect prey invisible to the human eye. Together, pterosaurs, birds, and bats transformed the aerial ecosystem forever. The sky that had once belonged almost entirely to insects was now crowded with vertebrate hunters. Creatures with sharper vision, stronger muscles, and more efficient respiratory systems moved through the air with growing dominance. For insects, the consequences were unavoidable. Large insects, once able to glide slowly through open skies, now faced predators capable of catching them with speed and accuracy. Bigger bodies became easier targets. Slower wings became a disadvantage in a world filled with agile vertebrate flyers. Natural selection responded once again. Smaller insects proved harder to catch, more maneuverable, and more capable of hiding within dense vegetation. Over time, the evolutionary pressure towards smaller size grew even stronger. The age when insects ruled the sky alone had ended. No, the air belonged to many different creatures, each competing within an ecosystem far more complex than the Carboniferous world had ever been. The giants of the insect age were gone, and the skies had changed forever. Yet the story leaves behind an intriguing question. Even today, insects remain relatively small. The descendants of those ancient giants still fill forests and wetlands across the planet. Yet, none approach the enormous scale their ancestors once achieved. To understand why, we must look closer at the limits imposed by the modern atmosphere and the ecosystems that surround us now. Insects are everywhere. They move through forests, deserts, wetlands, and cities. They pollinate flowers, recycle decaying plants, and form the quiet foundation of many ecosystems. More species of insects exist than any other group of animals on Earth. Their success is undeniable. Yet despite their extraordinary diversity, one thing seems strangely absent. None of them approach the colossal sizes seen in the Carboniferous world. Modern dragonflies may glide elegantly above ponds and rivers, but their wings rarely stretch beyond a few centimeters. Millipedes still wander across forest floors, yet they remain small enough to hide beneath fallen leaves. The enormous forms that once dominated prehistoric landscapes never returned. The reason lies deep within the biology of insects themselves. Unlike mammals, birds, or reptiles, insects do not rely on lungs or circulating blood to deliver oxygen throughout their bodies. Instead, they depend on a network of tiny tubes known as trachea. These tubes carry oxygen directly from the outside air to the tissues that require it. Air enters through small openings along the insect's body called spiracles. From there it spreads through branching tracheal channels, reaching muscles, nerves, and organs through diffusion. For small creatures, this system works remarkably well. Oxygen does not need to travel far, and the simple design allows insects to function with great efficiency. But as body size increases, the system faces a challenge. Diffusion is slow. The farther oxygen must travel through those microscopic tubes, the harder it becomes to supply enough of it to every cell. Large insects require more oxygen to fuel their muscles and metabolism, yet their breathing system struggles to deliver it across greater distances inside the body. This creates a natural limit. Under modern atmospheric conditions, oxygen concentrations remain too low to support truly massive insect bodies. The air simply does not contain enough oxygen to allow diffusion to supply tissues across large distances. Scientists have tested this idea in laboratory experiments. When insects are raised in environments where oxygen levels are artificially increased, they often grow larger than normal. Their bodies respond quickly to the richer air, producing slightly bigger wings and longer bodies than those raised under standard conditions. The result echoes the ancient world. In oxygen-rich environments, insects can grow larger, but even these ex-modern insects rarely approach the immense size of Carboniferous giants, because the atmosphere today never reaches those ancient oxygen concentrations. The conditions that once supported dragonflies and giant millipedes simply no longer exist. In this sense, the disappearance of giant insects was not a failure of evolution. They bombed perfectly for the world in which they lived. Their tracheal systems functioned beautifully in an atmosphere thick with oxygen. When that atmosphere changed, the rules of survival changed with it. Evolution adjusted accordingly. Our Somala insects became more efficient in the new environment. Their bodies required less oxygen and could function comfortably within the limits of modern air. Over millions of years, natural selection reinforced those advantages. The giants faded, not because they were weak or poorly designed, but because the planet that supported them had transformed. They belonged to a world where oxygen filled the skies in greater abundance than today. And that world is gone. Yet atmospheric oxygen is only part of the story. Even if the air today suddenly grew richer, insects would still face another powerful challenge shaping their size and behavior. The modern skies are no longer empty. Even if the atmosphere once again held more oxygen, another obstacle would still stand between insects and the enormous bodies of their ancestors. The skies themselves have changed. During the Carboniferous age, insects rose into an aerial world that was almost entirely empty. Their wings carried them into a realm with little competition and few predators capable of following them into the air. For millions of years, they explored that space freely, evolving larger bodies and broader wings. Today, the same skies tell a very different story. Across forests, wetlands, fields and rivers, countless animals patrol the air with remarkable precision. Birds glide above treetops, scanning for movement below. Swallows and swifts slice through the atmosphere at high speed, catching insects mid-flight with effortless accuracy. Even small songbirds spend much of their day darting through the air in pursuit of flying prey. And when daylight fades, another group takes control. Bats emerge from caves, hollow trees, and hidden crevices as darkness settles across the land. Their wings beat rapidly against the evening air as they begin a nightly hunt that has been unfolding for tens of millions of years. Unlike birds, bats possess a remarkable tool known as echolocation. By sending out high-frequency calls and listening to the returning echoes, they create a detailed map of their surroundings in complete darkness. Tiny insects flying through the night sky appear to them as bright signals within this invisible acoustic landscape. A moth drifting silently above a forest may believe it is hidden by darkness. To a hunting bat, it is perfectly visible. Birds and bats are not the only predators shaping the insect world. Many reptiles and amphibians also capture flying prey whenever the opportunity appears. Lizards leap from branches to snatch insects passing overhead. Frogs wait patiently near water's edge, launching lightning, fast tongues toward anything small enough to swallow. Together these hunters create constant evolutionary pressure. In a world filled with tracking and catching insects in the air, body size becomes a critical factor in survival. Large insects would move more slowly through the sky. Their wings would require greater effort to maneuver. Their bodies would cast larger silhouettes against the light. They would be easier to catch. Small insect. Their bodies allow quick turns and sudden changes in direction. They can vanish among leaves or dive into dense vegetation when danger appears. Their small size makes them harder targets for birds, bats, and other hunters. That rely on speed and accuracy, natural selection reinforces these advantages. Insects that remain small and agile are more likely to survive long enough to reproduce. Those that grow too large risk becoming easy prey in a crowded aerial ecosystem. The result is a sky very different from the one that existed hundreds of millions of years ago. What was once an open domain dominated by insects alone has become one of the most competitive environments on the planet. The air above forests and wetlands is now shared by countless species, each adapting to survive in a complex network of hunters and prey. Even if oxygen levels were slightly higher today, giant insects would still face enormous challenges. Their size would make them visible targets. Their slower movements would leave them vulnerable to faster predators. The skies that once welcomed giant wings are no longer empty. Yet this realization invites a curious question. If the atmosphere changed again, if oxygen levels somehow began rising once more, could insects ever grow larger again, even within the crowded skies of the modern world? After hearing the story of ancient skies filled with enormous wings, a natural question begins to form. Could it happen again? If the Earth once supported insects as large as hawks, what prevents such creatures from appearing in the future? Could a world return where dragonflies once again glide above forests, with wings wider than a human arm at first glance? The idea does not seem entirely impossible. Scientists studying insect respiration have shown that body size responds strongly to oxygen levels in the surrounding atmosphere. In laboratory experiments, insects raised in environments with elevated oxygen often grow noticeably larger than those raised under modern conditions. Their wings stretch slightly wider. Their bodies grow longer. The limits that normally constrain their size loosen when the air becomes richer. These results echo what the fossil record already suggests. When Earth's atmosphere once held far more oxygen than it does today, insects were able to grow far larger than modern species. So if oxygen levels were to rise again someday, could insects once again reach those ancient dimensions? The answer is more complicated than it first appears. Atmospheric oxygen was only one piece of the Carboniferous puzzle. The world that produced giant insects contained a unique combination of environmental conditions that no longer exist today. The forests were different. The warmer and more humid across regions of the planet. Wetlands stretched across continents, creating stable ecosystems where giant insects could thrive for millions of years. Modern landscapes are far more varied. Forests still exist, but they are divided by mountains, deserts, and grasslands. The climate fluctuates across seasons and continents in ways that would have been unfamiliar to the Carboniferous world. But the most important difference lies above the forests. The skies are no longer empty. During the Carboniferous age, insects were the first creatures to master powered flight. They explored an aerial environment with almost no competition from vertebrate animals. For millions of years, their wings moved through open skies, free from predators capable of pursuing them in the air. Today, birds patrol nearly every ecosystem on the planet, from dense rainforests to open plains. Bats hunt insects throughout the night skies of nearly every continent. Even reptiles and amphibians capture flying insects whenever they pass within reach. In such an environment, enormous insects would struggle to survive. Larger bodies would move more slowly through the air and become easier targets for fast, agile predators. Even if oxygen levels allowed them to grow larger, evolutionary pressure would still favor smaller, more maneuverable insects capable of escaping these hunters. So while slightly larger insects might evolve under different atmospheric conditions, the towering dragonflies and massive millipedes of the Carboniferous world would almost certainly never return in the same form. They belong to a very specific moment in Earth's history. The atmosphere was different. The forests were different. The skies themselves were different. For tens of millions of years, those conditions aligned in a rare and extraordinary way. Insects rose into the air, grew to astonishing sizes, and ruled the skies of a planet that worked by different rules. But then the world changed, and the giant fadded with it. The story does not end there, because while the giants vanished, insects themselves endured, and their legacy continues shaping the modern world in ways most people rarely notice. When the giants of the insect world faded from the skies, it might seem as though insects themselves were losing their place in the story of life. The enormous wings that once crossed ancient wetlands were gone. The giant millipedes vanished from forest floors, and the age of colossal arthropods slipped quietly into the past. But something remarkable happened next. Insects did not disappear. In fact, if we look across the modern world, their presence becomes almost impossible to ignore. In tropical rainforests, the air hums with movement as beetles crawl along bark, ant bents build vast underground keddies, and butterflies between bright flowers. In deserts where few large animals can survive, tiny beetles cross scorching sand while others collect droplets of morning moisture from fog. Even in the thin air of high mountains, insects flutter through alpine meadows, where larger creatures struggle to endure. Nearly everywhere life exists on land, insects are there. Scientists have already identified more than 1 million species of insects, yet researchers believe this number represents only a fraction of the total. Many more species remain hidden in remote forests, deep soils, and unexplored ecosystems. Some estimates suggest that millions of insect species may still await discovery. No other group of animals comes close to this level of diversity. Insects inhabit near every ecological niche imaginable. They tunnel beneath the soil, bore through wood, skim across the surfaces of lakes, and drift through the highest layers of forest canopies. Some live within the bodies of other organisms, while others thrive in environments that seem hostile to nearly all forms of life. What makes this even more extraordinary is the number of planetary crises insects have survived. Over hundreds of millions of years, Earth has experienced dramatic environmental upheavals. Continents have collided and separated. Ice ages have advanced and retreated. Asteroid impacts and volcanic eruptions have reshaped ecosystems across the globe. Each time, countless species disappeared, yet insects endured. When the Permian extinction erased much of life from land and sea, insects survived. When the age of dinosaurs rose and later vanished in the aftermath of a cosmic collision, insects continued adapting to the changing world. Their resilience is not accident. Several biological advantages give insects an extraordinary ability to endure environmental change. Their small bodies require relatively little energy to survive. Many species reproduce quickly, producing large numbers of offspring within short periods of time. This rapid reproduction allows populations to evolve and adapt far faster than larger animals, with long life cycles. Where a large vertebrate species might take thousands of years to adapt to a changing climate, insect populations can begin evolving new traits within a handful of generations. Their diversity also provides a powerful form of resilience. If one species struggles under new conditions, another may already possess the traits needed to survive. Across millions of species, insects collectively explore nearly every possible survival strategy. This perspective transforms the story we have been following. The giant insects of the Carboniferous were spectacular, but they were only one chapter in a much larger evolutionary success. Their disappearance did not signal the failure of insects as a group. Instead, it marked the beginning of a quieter dominance. While the giants vanished, their smaller descendants spread across the planet with astonishing adaptability. Today, they remain the most numerous and diverse animals on land, shaping ecosystems in ways that go unnoticed. The true legacy of the insect world was never its giants. It was its resilience. And understanding that resilience requires looking closer at the biological traits that made insects so difficult to eliminate in the first place. When people imagine powerful animals, their thoughts often drift towards size. Massive dinosaurs, towering elephants, or powerful predators capture the imagination easily. Strength, after all, seems to belong to the largest bodies. But evolution does not always reward size. In many cases, survival favors the opposite strategy. Small creatures often possess advantages that large animals cannot match, and insects demonstrate this principle more clearly than almost any other group of organisms. Their bodies may appear fragile, yet their size gives them a remarkable ability to endure conditions that would challenge much larger animals. One of the simplest advantages lies in energy. Large animals require enormous amounts of food to maintain their bodies. Their muscles, organs, and metabolism consume energy continuously. If food becomes scarce, survival quickly becomes difficult. Even short disruptions to an ecosystem can live by a different set of rules. Their small bodies require only tiny amounts of energy to function. A beetle, an ant, or a grasshopper can survive on food sources so small they might be invisible to larger creatures. A single leaf, a fragment of plant tissue, or a drop of nectar may provide enough energy to sustain them. This efficiency allows insects to persist in places where larger animals would struggle to find enough resources. Their size also allows them to endure environmental changes more easily. Droughts, sudden temperature shifts, or temporary food shortages can devastate large animal populations. But insects often possess ways to wait out these difficult periods. Some species enter states of suspended development, slowing their metabolism dramatically until conditions improve. Eggs or larvae may remain dormant for months, sometimes even years, before continuing their life cycle when rain returns or temperatures rise. To the outside world, they seem to vanish. Then suddenly, when the environment becomes favorable again, they reappear in astonishing numbers. Reproduction plays another critical role in this resilience. Many insect species produce hundreds or even thousands of offspring within a single generation. While many of these young never survive to adulthood, the sheer number ensures that at least some individuals will endure. This rapid reproduction allows natural selection to act quickly. When environmental conditions shift, populations can evolve in relatively short periods of time. Traits that help survival spread rapidly through the population, allowing insects to adapt far faster than many larger animals. Flexibility extends beyond reproduction. Insects are masters of finding places to live. Their small bodies allow them to occupy ecological niches that larger animals cannot reach. Some species burrow deep within the soil. Others live beneath stones or inside the bark of trees. Many exist within complex underground networks, built by ants or termites. Some insects even live inside other organisms, forming relationships that range from harmless coexistence to parasitic dependence. Because insects exploit so many different habitats, they rarely depend on a single environment for survival. When one ecosystem changes or disappears, other niches remain available for colonization. This versatility explains why insects endured events that wipe out many larger species. When ecosystems collapse, flexibility becomes more valuable than strength. Creatures capable of adjusting to new conditions survive, while those tied too closely to one environment often vanish. In this sense, the success of insects reflects a deeper principle within evolution. Survival rarely belongs to the largest or most powerful creatures. It belongs to those most capable of adapting. And over hundreds of years, insects have refined that ability to an extraordinary degree. Yet survival alone does not fully explain their success. Across the long history of life on Earth, insects have also developed some of the most sophisticated survival strategies in the entire animal kingdom. The long survival of insects across Earth's history did not happen by accident. Their success built upon an astonishing range of adaptations, solutions shaped by millions of years of experimentation. Look closely at the natural world, and insects begin revealing abilities that feel almost unbelievable. Some species disappear in plain sight. Leaf insects, for example, resemble the plants they live among so perfectly that even careful observers struggle to distinguish them from real leaves. Their bodies are flattened and shaped with tiny veins that mimic the patterns of foliage. Some even carry subtle imperfections, small holes, and ragged edges that imitate the damage caused by weather or feeding animals. To a predator scanning the branches of a tree, these insects are nearly invisible. Others use a similar strategy in different forms. Stick insects stretch their thin bodies along twigs, blending so completely with surrounding branches that they appear to be part of the plant itself. Certain caterpillars resemble bird droppings, disguising themselves as something predators instinctively ignore. Camouflage insects to survive in a world filled with hungry eyes. But some species rely on defense rather than concealment. The bombardier beetle, for example, possesses a chemical weapon hidden within its body. When threatened, it releases a hot, explosive spray of chemicals capable of deterring predators far larger than itself. The reaction occurs so rapidly that the mixture emerges almost boiling, accompanied by a small popping sound as it bursts outward. For a creature only a few centimeters long, it is a surprisingly effective defense. In other cases, survival depends not on individual strength but on cooperation. Ants have evolved some of the most complex societies found anywhere in the animal kingdom. Within a single colony, thousands or even millions of individuals perform specialized roles. Worker ants gather food and care for young. Soldier ants defend the colony against threats. A queen focuses entirely on reproduction, producing the next generation that will sustain the community. Together they function almost like a single organism, coordinating tasks and responding to changes in their environment with remarkable efficiency. Yet perhaps the most extraordinary adaptation of insects is something more subtle. Transformation Many insects live not one life, but several. A butterfly begins as a tiny egg laid on the underside of a leaf. From that egg emerges a caterpillar, an entirely different creature, built for eating and growing rather than flying. The caterpillar spends its days consuming leaves, storing energy that will later fuel its transformation. Then, enclosed within a protective casing, the caterpillar becomes something else entirely. Inside the chrysalis, the body reorganizes itself. Tissues dissolve and reform. Wings appear where none existed before. When the transformation is complete, the adult butterfly emerges, no longer a crawling leaf eater, but a flying pollinator, drifting from flower to flower. This process, known as metamorphosis, allows insects to divide their life stages into completely different ecological roles. The young feed in one environment, while adults move through another. Because each stage uses different resources, competition between generations disappears. It is a remarkably efficient strategy. Through camouflage, chemical defenses, complex societies, and radical transformations, insects have explored survival strategies, unlike those seen in most other animals. While the giants of the changing atmospheric conditions, insects themselves never stopped evolving. They continued adapting, diversifying, and spreading across every continent on Earth. The story that began with ancient giants now shifts toward the incredible diversity of the modern insect world. And within that diversity lies an intriguing question. If insects once grew far larger than anything alive today, could certain conditions allow them to grow larger again? When we think about creatures small enough to ignore, a fly drifting past a window, a beetle crawling along a garden path, a butterfly gliding quietly between flowers, compared to the enormous griffinflies of the Carboniferous, modern insects seem almost delicate. Yet scattered across the planet are species that hint at what insects are still capable of becoming. In remote forests, islands, and tropical jungles, certain insects grow far larger than most people expect. These modern giants may not rival the prehistoric rulers of the sky, but they remind us that the potential for size still lingers within the insect world. One of the most striking examples lies far from most human settlements. On the islands of New Zealand, hidden among dense vegetation and rocky hillsides, lives the giant whitter. At first glance, it resembles an oversized cricket, with thick legs and long antennae extending from its head. But its size makes it something extraordinary. Some species of giant whitter can grow heavier than a small bird. Their bodies are thick and powerful, built more for walking than for jumping. In quiet forests at night, they move slowly among leaves and branches, feeding on plants and insects alike. To encounter one unexpectedly can feel like stepping briefly into a prehistoric world. Elsewhere in tropical forests, other insects display equally surprising proportions. Dicks, masters of camouflage, sometimes stretch longer than 30 centimeters from head to tail. Their bodies resemble thin twigs so closely that predators struggle to distinguish them from the branches they cling to. When they remain still, they vanish almost completely into the forest around them. Some species even sway gently in the wind, mimicking the movement of real plants. In South American rainforests, another insect carries an entirely different kind of grandeur. The Hercules beetle is famous for the enormous horn extending from its head and thorax, a structure used by males during contests over territory and mates. These beetles can reach impressive sizes, their armored bodies glinting beneath tropical sunlight as they climb tree trunks and fallen logs. The horn itself may grow longer than the beetle's body, creating an insect that appears almost fantastical in shape. Even the night sky holds its own giants. Certain moths possess wingspans approaching 30 centimeters, their broad wings drifting through the darkness with a slow, almost silent rhythm. When one settles against a tree trunk, its patterned wings can resemble dried leaves or fragments of bark, blending perfectly with its surroundings. To a casual observer, these insects may seem enormous, but compared with the giants of the Carboniferous world, they remain modest in scale. The largest modern dragonflies span only a fraction of the wings once carried by ancient griffinflies. Even the longest stick insects fall far short of the massive arthropods that once crawled through prehistoric forests. Still, these modern species reveal something important. The genetic potential for remarkable size has not vanished entirely from the insect world. Under the right environmental conditions, insects can still grow into forms that surprise us with their scale and complexity. Each of these creatures serves as a living reminder of a much older lineage. They are descendants of animals that once ruled ancient skies and forest floors, adapting across hundreds of millions of years as the planet around them changed. Seen this way, modern insects no longer appear insignificant. They are the surviving branches of an ancient evolutionary tree, one capable of producing forms far stranger and larger than we might expect, and their distribution across the planet raises an interesting question. Why do some places seem to produce larger insects than others? Eyeing certain corners of the world, nature performs unusual experiments. Remote islands, separated from continents by wide oceans, often become laboratories where evolution explores unexpected possibilities. Animals arriving in these isolated environments sometimes change dramatically over generations, growing either much smaller or much larger than their mainland relatives. Scientists call this phenomenon island gigantism. When species live in places with fewer predators and limited competition, the pressures shaping their bodies shift. Creatures that must remain small and cautious on continents may suddenly find themselves in environments where survival rules are different. Without constant danger, size can become an advantage rather than a risk. New Zealand offers one of the most remarkable examples of this pattern. For millions of years, these islands lacked many of the mammalian predators common on other continents. There were no foxes stalking the forests, no small carnivores prowling through the undergrowth. The ecological roles normally filled by mammals remained largely empty. In that quiet space, insects stepped forward. The giant weta became one of the most striking results of this evolutionary freedom. These large, heavy-bodied insects wander through forests at night, feeding on leaves and small animals. Their thick legs carry them slowly along branches and across the ground, often without the speed or agility required by insects living among constant predators. In many ways, they behave less like insects and more like small mammals. They graze on vegetation, explore the forest floor, and occupy ecological niches that, on other continents, would belong to rodents or other small herbivores. Their bodies grew larger over time because the usual threats that punish large insects simply were not present. Other islands reveal similar patterns. Large stick insects inhabit isolated forests, where camouflage allows them to remain hidden despite their impressive length. Beetles in certain environments grow heavier and more robust than their mainland relatives. In each case, isolation alters the evolutionary pressures acting upon these species. Predators matter. When a creature does not need to evade constant attack, its body can change in new ways. Larger size may allow it to store more energy, compete for food more effectively, or reproduce more successfully. Evolution responds to the conditions surrounding it. But even in these unusual environments, there are limits. Island gigantism sects far larger than those commonly seen in most ecosystems, yet even the most impressive modern insects remain much smaller than the giants of the Carboniferous world. The atmosphere itself still imposes boundaries that isolated ecosystems cannot overcome. The tracheal breathing system of insects continues to rely on diffusion. No matter how safe the environment becomes, oxygen must still travel through those delicate tubes to reach every cell. Without the extraordinarily oxygen-rich air of ancient times, insect bodies cannot grow to the massive sizes once seen in prehistoric forests. So island gigantism offers only a glimpse of what once existed. These remind us that insects still carry the evolutionary potential for impressive size when conditions allow. But the full scale of Carboniferous insects belong to a world where both the environment and the atmosphere work together in ways that no longer occur. Today still, the idea raises a fascinability. If conditions changed again, if the atmosphere shifted, if ecosystems transformed, could the insect world once more produce giants that echo the ancient rulers of the sky? That question leads us into the final part of our exploration. The idea of giant insects returning to the modern world is fascinating, and scientists have explored the question with careful experiments and observation. The answer begins with the same factor that once allowed those giants to exist in the first place: the air itself. Insects breathe in a way that ties their bodies closely to the atmosphere around them. Oxygen does not travel through blood the way it does in mammals or birds. Instead, it diffuses through a branching system of tracheal tubes that carry air directly into their tissues. The efficiency of this system depends heavily on the amount of oxygen present in the surrounding air. Because of this, researchers have long wondered what would happen if insects were raised in environments containing more oxygen than modern air provides. In laboratory settings, scientists have tested this idea. In carefully controlled chambers where oxygen levels can be increased above the normal concentration found in the atmosphere today. The results are subtle but consistent. Insects growing in oxygen-rich environments tend to become slightly larger. Their bodies stretch a bit longer. Their wings may expand a little wide. The increased oxygen allows diffusion through their tracheal systems to work more efficiently, supporting tissues that would otherwise receive less oxygen under normal conditions. These experiments confirm something important. Oxygen levels still influence insect size, yet the growth observed in these experiments remains modest. Even with increased oxygen in laboratory environments, insects do not suddenly grow into creatures resembling the dragonflies of ancient skies. Their size increases only within a limited range. The reason lies in the difference between modern atmospheric conditions and those of the distant past. During the oxygen concentrations may have reached 30 to 35% of the atmosphere. Today, that number hovers around 21%. This gap may sound small, but biologically it represents a dramatic shift in the resources available. Even if oxygen levels rose slightly in the future, they would still remain far below the extraordinary concentrations that once existed. And the atmosphere is not the only difference between past and present. The ecological world surrounding insects has transformed as well. The skies above forests and wetlands are now crowded with vertebrate hunters. Birds patrol the daytime agile flight. Bats emerge at night, navigating darkness with precise echolocation as they capture insects mid-flight. Many insects growing unusually large would immediately become visible to these predators. Where the Carboniferous sky offered a vast and mostly empty hunting ground, the modern sky is one of the most competitive environments on Earth. Large insects would face constant danger from animals designed specifically to catch them. Together, these factors create a clear conclusion. The giants of the insect world were not impossible creatures, nor were they evolutionary mistakes. They were the natural result of conditions unlike those we experience today. An oxygen-rich atmosphere, endless swamp forests, and skies free from vertebrate hunters combined to create a moment when insects could grow to extraordinary size. But that moment passed, the Earth changed, and life adapted along with it. Modern insects remain remarkable in their diversity and resilience, but the exact combination of conditions that once produced the giants has never returned. Yet insects continue shaping the world in ways that are far more significant than their size might suggest. And to understand that influence, we must look not at ancient fossils or atmospheric chemistry, but at the quiet work insects perform every day across the living planet. After millions of years of change, the story of insects arrives in the present. The ancient giants are gone. The atmosphere has settled into the balance we know today, and the sekis are filled with birds and bats rather than enormous dragonflies. At first glance, insects now seem small and almost insignificant compared with the dramatic creatures that once ruled prehistoric ecosystems. But look closer at the modern world, and a different truth begins to appear. Across forests, farms, and cities, insects are constantly at work. Their labor is so quiet and continuous that it often goes unnoticed. Yet without them, the systems supporting life on land would begin to unravel. Consider a warm spring morning in flowering meadow. Bees drift from blossom to blossom, their bodies dusted with grains of pollen. As they gather nectar for their colonies, they carry pollen between plants, allowing flowers to reproduce and produce seeds. This simple exchange powers much of the plant life surrounding us. Many of the crops humans rely on, apples, almonds, berries, tomatoes, and countless others, depend on pollinating insects to complete their life cycles. Without these tiny visitors moving pollen between flowers, many plants would struggle to produce fruit or seeds. The food on dinner tables around the world is quietly connected to the movement of wings in gardens and orchards. Pollination is only one part of the story. In the shaded corners of forests, beetles and other insects perform a different task. They chew through fallen branches, burrow into dead wood, and feed on leaves scattered across the ground. What may appear to be simple feeding behavior is actually part of a vast healing system. Organic material that might otherwise accumulate and decay slowly is broken down and returned to the soil. Nutrients locked inside plants are released again, ready to support new growth. Without these decomposers, forests would soon become clogged with layers of dead material, and the natural cycle of nutrients would slow dramatically. Elsewhere, ants move in long organized lines across the ground, carrying fragments of food back to their colonies. Beneath the surface, entire underground networks form as ants tunnel through soil, mixing and aerating it in the process. These activities help maintain healthy ground for plant roots and microorganisms alike. Some insects perform yet another role, controlling populations of other species. Lady beetles, lasewings, and predatory wasps feed on insects that damage crops and vegetation. By keeping these populations in balance, they prevent certain species from multiplying to destructive levels. In this way, insects help stabilize ecosystems that humans depend upon. Despite their small size, the influence of insects spreads across nearly every environment on Earth. They pollinate plants, recycle nutrients, maintain soil health, and regulate populations within complex ecological webs. Their work rarely draws attention, yet human civilization relies on it, more than most people realize. The descendants of creatures that once dominated ancient skies now operate quietly in the background of modern life. They no longer tower over forests with wings as wide as hawks, but their importance has not diminished. In many ways it has grown. Without insects, the ecosystems that support forests, farms, and wildlife would begin to falter. The stability of insects on their constant activity. The smallest creatures around us may indeed be performing some of the most important work on the planet. And yet, despite their resilience across hundreds of millions of years, the insect world today faces pressures unlike those encountered in the distant past. For hundreds of millions of years, insects have endured almost everything the planet could throw at them. They survived volcanic winters, shifting continents, mass extinctions, and climates that swung from ice-covered landscapes to tropical worlds. Again and again, ecosystems collapsed and rebuilt themselves, yet insects remained. But in recent decades, a quieter and more uncertain pattern has begun to attract the attention of scientists. In many parts of the world, insect populations appear to be shrinking. The change is not always obvious. Insects are small, and their numbers can rise and fall naturally from year to year. Yet long-term studies in several regions have begun revealing a trend that researchers are struggling to fully understand. In parts of Europe, carefully monitored nature reserves have recorded significant declines in the overall biomass of flying insects. Traps that once filled with moths, beetles, and flies now collect fewer individuals than they did decades ago. Similar observations have emerged from certain regions of North America and other parts of the world. The causes are complex, and scientists are still working to understand them. A factor is the changing landscape itself. As cities expand and agricultural land replaces natural habitats, many insects lose the environments they depend on for food and reproduction. Fields once bordered by wildflowers and hedgerows may become uniform stretches of crops, where fewer insect species can thrive. Climate change also plays a role. Temperature shifts can alter the timing of plant growth and insect life cycles. When these patterns fall out of sync, insects may struggle to find the resources they need at the right time. Some species adapt quickly, while others face increasing difficulty. Pollution and pesticides add further pressures. Chemicals designed to control agricultural pests can sometimes affect other insects as well, reducing populations in ways that ripple through ecosystems. None of these influences operate in isolation. They combine in subtle ways that researchers are still piecing together. The result is not a single global event like the mass extinctions of deep history, but a patchwork of regional changes that together raise an important question. What happens when insects decline? The answer extends far beyond the insects themselves. Many animals depend heavily on insects as a primary food source. Birds feed their chicks with caterpillars and flies. Frogs and lizards hunt insects along riverbanks and wetlands. Even mammals such as bats rely on nightly flights through swarms of insects to survive. When insect populations change, the effects can spread through entire ecosystems. Plants may struggle without pollinators. Predators may lose an essential source of food. The delicate connecting soil, plants, and animals can shift in ways that take years to fully understand. Yet scientists approach this topic with caution. Insects have proven extraordinarily resilient across the history of life. Their ability to reproduce quickly and adapt to changing conditions remains one of their greatest strengths. Declines in some regions do not necessarily mean insects are disappearing everywhere. Instead, researchers see the situation as an evolving scientific puzzle. The story echoes patterns we have already encountered in Earth's past. Environmental changes, whether driven by natural forces or human activity, reshape ecosystems over time. Species by adapting or sometimes disappearing. Insects have navigated such transitions before. Whether they will adapt once again remains a question still unfolding. To understand what might come next, it helps to look beyond the present moment and consider the deeper relationship insects have always shared with the planet itself. When we step back and look across the immense timeline of Earth's history, the story of insects begins to feel almost timeless. Long before humans walked across the planet, before dinosaurs dominated the land, before forests resembled the ones we know today, insects were already here. Their lineage stretches back more than 400 million years. In that distant past, the continents themselves looked unfamiliar. Vast oceans separated strange landmasses covered with early plants that had only recently begun colonizing the land. Among those primitive ecosystems, the ancestors of modern insects began exploring new possibilities, crawling through soil, feeding on plants, and eventually discovering something remarkable: flight. They were the first animals on Earth to truly master the sky. Long before birds or bats existed, insects had already taken to the air. Their wings carried them across ancient landscapes, allowing them to search for food, escape predators, and spread across continents in ways few other animals could match. Over time, their bodies diversified into countless forms. Some became delicate pollinators drifting between flowers. Others evolved into armored beetles capable of burrowing through wood and soil. Dragonflies developed powerful flight that allowed them to hunt other insects with astonishing precision. And for a brief moment in Earth's history, some insects grew to sizes that seem almost unbelievable today. Meganeura's sky soared above vast swamp forests with wings wider than many birds. Giant millipedes moved through dense vegetation along the forest floor. The air itself held enough oxygen to support bodies far larger than those found in modern ecosystems. The planet changed. Atmospheric conditions shifted, climates evolved, and new animals entered the skies. The giants disappeared, leaving behind only fossils pressed into ancient stone. Yet the lineage that produced them did not vanish. It adapted. 80 brought millions of years. Insects continued evolving alongside the changing planet. They survived ice ages that reshaped continents with glaciers. They endured volcanic eruptions that darkened skies and altered climates. They even persisted through asteroid impacts that wiped out entire groups of animals. While many species vanished during these upheavals, insects as a whole endured. Their ability to adapt, to reproduce quickly, occupy countless ecological niches and evolve new strategies for survival, allowed them to navigate environmental crises that proved catastrophic for many larger animals. Today, their descendants inhabit nearly every environment on Earth. They pollinate plants in tropical forests and temperate fields. They recycle nutrients within soil and fallen wood. They form complex societies beneath the ground and drift silently through the air above lakes and rivers. Their presence is so common that it often goes unnoticed. Yet every insect alive today carries within it stretches back through unimaginable time. Each tiny wing beating above a garden flower belongs to a lineage that once filled prehistoric skies and survived planet transformations beyond anything humans have ever witnessed. Seen this way, insects are not merely small creatures buzzing through the background of modern life. They are living fragments of Earth's ancient story, and their rise and fall, from giant rulers of the Carboniferous sky to the countless species surrounding us today, offers a deeper lesson about how life responds to the ever-changing world. Because the story of giant insects is not only about the past, it reveals something fundamental about the nature of life on Earth itself. Step back for a moment from forests, insects, and individual species, and the story begins to look very different. Imagine rising slowly above the modern Earth. Forests fade into patterns of green, deserts stretch in quiet shades of gold and red. Oceans merge into a vast blue surface, broken only by drifting clouds. From far enough away, the entire planet appears calm and balanced, a stable world turning silently through space. But this calm appearance hides a deeper truth. Earth has never been still. Beneath the thin skin of soil and ocean that supports life, the planet is constantly reshaping itself. Continents drift slowly across the surface. Like enormous rafts of stone, over millions of years they collide, split apart, and rearrange the geography of the world. Mountains rise where plates push against one another. Oceans widen and close. Land once near the equator can gradually slide toward the poles, carrying its ecosystems along for the journey. Even the atmosphere, the invisible ocean of air surrounding the planet, has changed again and again throughout Earth's history. The air we breathe today feels permanent, yet it represents only one chapter in a much longer story. Oxygen levels repeatedly over hundreds of millions of years, shaped by volcanic activity, the spread of forests, and the slow burial of carbon beneath the surface. Climate has followed similar rhythms. Ice ages have advanced across continents and then retreated. Tropical forests have expanded and vanished. Entire ecosystems have appeared, flourished, and eventually disappeared as the environment shifted around them. Within this larger perspective, the age of giant insects begins to make sense. Those enormous creatures were not strange accidents of evolution. They were the natural outcome of a planet passing through a very particular set of conditions. During the Carboniferous covered large portions of the continents. Plants pulled carbon dioxide from the air and buried enormous amounts of carbon beneath the earth in the form of coal. As that carbon disappeared underground, oxygen accumulated in the atmosphere. The air grew richer, and in that oxygen-rich world, insects, whose bodies rely on oxygen diffusing through delicate tracheal tubes, could grow far larger than they can today. But the conditions that created those giants did not last forever. Continents drifted, climates changed, and the forests that once dominated the landscape slowly declined. As carbon returned to the atmosphere and oxygen levels fell, the biological limits on insect size returned as well. The giants faded away. Seen from this wider vantage point, their rise and fall was not mysterious at all. It was simply the result of Earth's long and restless evolution. Life does not exist apart from the planet that hosts it. Every organism, from the smallest insect to the largest animal, evolves within boundaries set by climate, atmosphere, geography, and countless other environmental factors. When those conditions change, life changes with them. The giant insects of the Carboniferous responded to the world available to them, just as modern species respond to the conditions surrounding them today. And this realization opens a fascinating possibility. If the Earth has transformed so dramatically in the past, producing worlds where dragonflies grew as large as birds, then how many other strange versions of this planet have existed across its deep history? If we could travel backward through time and watch the Earth changing across billions of years, the planet might feel less like a single world and more like a long series of different ones. The landscapes we recognize today. Forests of oak and pine, grassy plains, oceans filled with familiar fish, represent only the latest version of a planet that has worn many different faces. Each era carried its own ecosystems, its own climates, and its own creatures perfectly suited to the conditions of their time. The Carboniferous world of giant insects was only one chapter in that long story. Long before dragonflies ruled oxygen, rich skies, the oceans belonged to creatures that seem almost alien by modern standards. Trilobites crawled along the seafloor in enormous numbers, their segmented bodies protected by hard shells. Strange armored fish patrolled ancient seas, their heavy plates forming natural shields against predators. Later the balance shifted again. During the Mesozoic era, vast continents supported forests filled with towering reptiles. Dinosaurs moved across plains and through thick vegetation, dominating land ecosystems for more than 100 million years. Some species grew as tall as buildings, while others evolved feathers and wings that eventually led to the birds we know today. Even these seemingly unstoppable creatures eventually disappeared. Asteroids struck the Earth 66 million years ago. Dust and debris spread through the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and altering global climates. Many species vanished, and ecosystems reorganized once again. Still later, massive ice sheets advanced across large parts of the planet during repeated ages. Entire landscapes were reshaped as glaciers carved valleys and pushed southward across continents. Forests retreated, new environments appeared, and animals adapted, or migrated in response to the shifting climate. Each of these worlds would have felt stable to the creatures living within them. A trilobite crawling across the seafloor could not imagine a future where its entire lineage vanished. Dinosaurs roaming lush Jurassic forests had no way of knowing that their age would one day end abruptly. Even the giant insects of the Carboniferous sky likely lived their lives under conditions that seemed permanent. But geological time tells a different story. From the perspective of millions of years, stability often proves temporary. Small changes accumulate until ecosystems reach a threshold where transformation becomes in climate patterns. Shifts as forests expand or disappear. Continents drift slowly into new positions, altering ocean currents and climate patterns. Evolution introduces new species that compete for resources in ways older organisms were never designed to handle. Eventually, the environment changes enough that once successful creatures find themselves in unfamiliar territory. This is precisely what happened to the giant insects. Their enormous bodies were perfectly suited to the oxygen, rich atmosphere of the Carboniferous world. In those conditions, they could fly, hunt, and reproduce with extraordinary success. But when the forest that sustained that atmosphere began fading and oxygen levels declined, the advantage of size disappeared. The skies that once supported giants became a place where smaller bodies were better suited to survival. Seen in this context, the story of giant insects becomes part of a larger truth about life on Earth. Even the most dominant creatures exist only as long as the planet's conditions allow. And that realization invites a thoughtful question. If the Earth has changed so many times before, what lessons might those ancient transformations offer to the world we live in today? After traveling across hundreds of millions of years, the story returns quietly to the present. Night settles over modern cities and lights glow beneath satellites drifting silently above the atmosphere. Forests still spread across continents, rivers wind through valleys, and insects move through the evening air much as they always have. A dragonfly hovers above a pond, bees drift between flowers in a garden. Ants move steadily across the soil carrying fragments of food back to their hidden colonies. At first glance, the world appears stable. At the history we have followed reveals something deeper. The planet that supports these familiar scenes has never been fixed in place. Its climate, atmosphere, and ecosystems have shifted again and again across immense spans of time. The story of giant insects makes this reality impossible to ignore. There was once a time when the sky itself held far more oxygen than it does today. Forests spread across continents in vast wetlands that no longer exist. In that world, insects could grow large enough to rival birds, ruling an aerial domain that would later belong to entirely different creatures. Then the environment changed. Continents drifted, climates shifted. The atmosphere gradually returned to conditions less suited to enormous insect bodies. The giants that once soared through prehistoric skies slowly faded from existence. Their disappearance was not a punishment or a failure. It was simply the result of a changing planet. This realization carries an important message, though not a dramatic one. It reminds us that life on Earth is always shaped by the conditions surrounding it. Every species, no matter how successful, exists within the boundaries created by climate, atmosphere, and ecosystems. When those boundaries shift, life must adapt. Sometimes that adaptation leads to new forms and new opportunities. Other times it leads to extinction, clearing space for different organisms to rise in their place. These outcomes are not opposites. They are parts of the same ongoing process through which life adjusts to a restless planet. The giant insects of the Carboniferous era disappeared, but their lineage did not vanish. Instead, it transformed. Their descendants spread into millions of species that now occupy nearly every environment on land. Dragonflies still glide above water. Beetles burrow through soil and wood. Butterflies carry pollen between flowers. Leaf continued evolving long after the giants were gone. Seen from this perspective, the story of giant insects is not only about prehistoric animals. It is a reminder of how closely life is connected to the world that sustains it. Atmospheres change. Ecosystems reorganize. Evolution responds to the shifting stage beneath its feet. Even the most dominant species are part of that larger system. The giants of the past remind us of this quiet truth. No creature exists apart from the conditions of the planet itself. And as the story draws toward its end, the journey returns to where it began. The forests fade into ancient wetlands once more, and the sky above them belongs again to creatures whose wings once carried them through an atmosphere unlike anything we know today. As the story draws toward its final chapter, the journey returns to the world where it first began. The modern planet fades quietly from view. Cities dim beneath the night. Forests dissolve into mist, and time itself seems to move backward, across millions of years. Slowly, the familiar world gives way to something older. The Carboniferous Earth. Warm air drifts across endless wetlands where towering plants rise above shallow water. Giant ferns stretch their fronds toward a pale sky, their leaves swaying gently in the humid breeze. Beneath them, the ground is soft, with layers of decaying vegetation slowly settling into dark peat. Tall, lycopsid trees stand like ancient pillars across the landscape. Their patterned trunks climb high above the swampy soil, supporting crowns of narrow leaves that rustle softly in the thick air. Everywhere the scent of damp earth and growing plants fills the atmosphere. It is a quiet world, but not an empty one. A shadow moves above the forest canopy. High in the sky, something glides through the warm air, with slow, deliberate wings. The shape resembles a dragonfly, yet far larger than any insect alive today. Its transparent wings stretch wide, catching the light as they beat steadily against the oxygen-rich atmosphere. This is a dragonfly, one of the great aerial hunters of the Carboniferous age. For a moment, the ancient world feels alive again. The creature drifts across the wetlands, its compound eyes scanning the landscape below. Smaller insects hover above pools of still water, while others crawl across leaves and tree trunks. With a sudden burst of motion, the dragonfly dives, capturing its prey before rising again into the open sky. Scenes like this unfolded for tens of millions of years. The environment that supported such creatures was the result of several powerful forces working together. Vast forests pulled carbon from the atmosphere and buried it beneath layers of sediment. Over time, that buried carbon formed the coal deposits that humans would one day mine from deep underground. As carbon disappeared from the atmosphere, oxygen accumulated. The air grew richer than it is today, allowing insects whose bodies relied on diffusion to grow larger than modern species could sustain. The skies themselves helped support their size. At the same time, another factor shaped this ancient ecosystem. The air above the forests remained largely empty of vertebrate flyers. Birds had not yet evolved, and bats would not appear for millions of years. With no aerial predators to challenge them, insects held nearly complete control of the sky. In that world, giant wings were not unusual. To the creatures living within the Carboniferous forests, the sight of enormous insects gliding overhead was simply part of everyday life. Dragonflies with wings wider than a human hand were not strange or mysterious. They were just another species moving through from our modern perspective. Do they appear extraordinary? The dragonfly continues drifting across the wetlands, its wings beating slowly as it glides above water and vegetation. Gradually it moves farther away, its shape fading into the pale mist rising from the swamp. For a moment, the sky seems empty again. Yet for millions of years belonged to insects. Their wings filled the air above forests and wetlands, ruling an ecosystem perfectly suited to their remarkable biology. But even worlds that appear timeless eventually change. The Carboniferous sky would not remain the same forever. The skies of the Carboniferous world did not lose their giants in a single dramatic moment. There was no sudden catastrophe that swept enormous dragonflies from the air or erased the giant millipedes from the forest floor overnight. Their disappearance unfolded in a quieter way, stretching across millions of years as the planet itself continued to change. At first, the differences would have been difficult to notice. The forests still stood tall above the wetlands. Warm air still drifted through the ancient ecosystems. Insects still filled the skies and undergrowth in astonishing numbers. To the creatures living within that world, life likely appeared much the same as it had for generations before. But subtle changes were already underway. The vast swamp forests that once dominated the landscape began shrinking as climates shifted and continents moved. Regions that had been permanently wet slowly became drier. New plant communities appeared, replacing the towering vegetation that had helped shape the ancient atmosphere. At the same time, oxygen levels in the air gradually declined. The atmosphere did not change overnight, but over long spans of time its chemistry drifted away from the unusual balance that had once allowed insects to grow so large. The oxygen-rich skies that had supported the dragonflies and arthropleura slowly became less favorable for enormous bodies. For insects whose breathing depended on diffusion through delicate tracheal tubes, that change mattered. Large bodies require more oxygen to deliver energy to their tissues. As oxygen levels fell, those massive forms became increasingly difficult to sustain. Muscles demanded more oxygen than the atmosphere could easily provide. In this new environment, smaller bodies held an advantage. Natural selection rarely eliminates species all at once. Instead, it gently favors traits that improve survival under changing conditions. Insects with slightly smaller bodies requiring less oxygen could move and reproduce more efficiently in the evolving atmosphere. Over many generations, those advantages accumulated. The fossil record preserves hints of this transformation. The enormous wings that once defined the Carboniferous skies appear less frequently in younger rock layers. Giant millipedes gradually vanish from the geological record. Their descendants remain, but their bodies shrink to sizes better suited to the changing world. The giants did not simply disappear. They became something else. Dragonflies continue to hunt above lakes and wetlands, though their wingspans were far smaller than those of their ancient ancestors. Beetles diversified into countless species capable of living in soil, wood, and water. Ants and termites formed complex societies that would one day dominate ecosystems across the planet. The lineage that once produced enormous insect predators did not end. It adapted. This is one of evolution's quiet truths. Extinction often reshapes life rather than erasing it entirely. Lineages bend and transform as the environment shifts, producing new forms capable of thriving under different conditions. The giant insects belonged to a world where oxygen was abundant, forests were vast, and the skies remained largely empty of vertebrate competitors. When that world faded, the giants faded with it. Yet their legacy never truly disappeared. Every dragonfly gliding above a modern pond, every beetle crawling through forest soil, every butterfly drifting between flowers carries a connection to those ancient ancestors. The giants did not fail. They simply lived in a world that no longer exists. And their story is part of a much larger pattern, one that reveals how life on Earth continually adapts as the planet itself changes. The ancient wetlands slowly fade from view. The towering lycopsid trees dissolve into mist, and the enormous wings of the Carboniferous sky disappear into deep time. Gradually the landscape changes again, returning to the world we recognize today. Forests spread across mountains and valleys. Rivers wind through green plains. Oceans move in slow rhythms beneath drifting clouds. From high above the atmosphere, the planet appears calm and complete, a familiar blue sphere turning quietly through space. Yet beneath that calm surface, the same processes that shape the world of giant insects are still at work. Earth continues to change. Tectonic plates move slowly across the planet's surface. Their motion is almost impossible to notice within a single lifetime, but across millions of years it rearranges entire continents. Mountains raise, oceans widen, and landscapes that once lay beneath tropical seas may eventually become dry land. The atmosphere evolves as well. Plants continue drawing carbon from the air through photosynthesis, while volcanoes release gases from deep within the planet. Oceans absorb and release carbon dioxide, influencing the chemistry of the atmosphere in ways that unfold gradually over centuries and millennia. Climate shifts follow these changes, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. The world that supports life today is only the latest arrangement of these forces. Just as ancient forests once transformed the atmosphere and allowed enormous insects to soar through Carboniferous skies, modern ecosystems continue shaping the planet in quiet ways that often escape our notice. Leaf and Earth remain deeply connected. Every organism alive today exists within the boundaries created by these planetary systems. The insects that buzz through gardens and wetlands are part of a lineage stretching back more than 400 million years. Their ancestors witnessed environments that would seem strange and unfamiliar to modern eyes. They lived beneath skies richer in oxygen than our own. They moved through forests. Unlike any that exist today, they survived planetary upheavals that erased entire groups of animals and reshaped ecosystems across continents. Through it all, insects endured. The giants of the Carboniferous age eventually vanished as the atmosphere and ecosystems that supported them changed. Their descendants continue conditions and spreading into the countless forms that fill the modern world. A dragonfly drifts above the surface of a quiet pond, adapting to new conditions and spreading as it glides through warm air, hovering briefly before darting forward in pursuit of a smaller insect. Compared to ancient skies, it seems small and delicate, that it carries the memory of that distant world within its lineage. The story of giant insects, then, is not only a tale about creatures of the past, it is part of a much larger narrative about life responding to a planet that never stands still. Ecosystems rise and fall. Atmospheres shift. Species appear, adapt, and sometimes disappear as the stage beneath them changes. Yet the story does not end. Life continues exploring new possibilities with every passing generation. The smallest wings beating through modern air still belong to descendants of an ancient experiment that began hundreds of millions of years ago. The giants of the past are gone, but their story remains alive in every insect that moves through the living world around us.